Welcome all to today's webinar, hosted in partnership with the Bridgespan Group and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're so glad that you've joined us. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the Manager of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is funding nonprofit endowments as an equity strategy, perspectives from funders and nonprofits. After my remarks, we'll ground ourselves in the data from CEP's brand new research report about endowments titled Funding Nonprofit Endowments, Foundation Perspectives and Practices, as well as Bridgespan's new case study focused on the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's approach to using endowments as an equity strategy. First, for those of you who are tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness, and for over 2 decades, we've sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspectives of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We're a nonprofit and rely on grantees and contributions to support our research and programs, so please reach out if you are interested in supporting us. Our calendar for opting into a round of grantee, donor, or staff surveys this year is nearly full, so please reach out if you work as a grant maker and would like to learn more about our assessments. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. So first of all, we are, of course, in webinar format, which means that all of you are muted and have your videos off. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we certainly hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to be as responsive as possible to as many questions as we can during our Q&A at the end of the webinar. We will not be using the hand raising function on the webinar as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. And if you require technical assistance at any time, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, and he can assist you, and I'll include his email in the chat box. We'll also be sharing some resources with you, as I said, via the chat box, so feel free to check there for any helpful links. If you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can do so in your Zoom control panel by clicking More and Captioning. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. We'll also include links and resources that you hear about today in that same email. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for supporting the completion of both publications being previewed today. And without further ado, I will pass the mic to Alicia Smith-Arriaga, CEP's Vice President of Research, to present CEP's findings. Alicia, over to you. Oh, it seems like, oh, there she is. Hi, Alicia.
Hi, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Oops. I'm excited to share today with you the results from CEP's newest report on funding nonprofit endowments, foundation perspectives and practices. And we can go to the next slide. Now, this work could not have been possible without the support of the research team and the external relations team at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. So I just want to say thank you, and especially to Emily Yang, who led much of the day-to-day work that is included in this report. So a special thank you to her as well. We can go to the next slide. So for this study, we surveyed foundations in the United States that provided $5 million or more in annual giving. And we received 283 responses for a 34% response rate. And then we also conducted interviews with 17 foundation leaders, 10 that fund endowments, and 7 who do not. And our analyses resulted in 3 key findings, which we will dive into next. So first key finding is that just under a third of foundations provide endowment grants. And these grants represent a small fraction of their giving. We see on the next slide specifically that 31% of the foundations that responded to our survey fund nonprofit endowments. On the next slide, we see that among the foundations that make nonprofit endowment grants, it is not a major part of their overall giving. The chart on the left shows that the majority of foundations that fund nonprofit endowments dedicate less than a quarter of their total grants to this funding. And the chart on the right shows similarly that most of these foundations dedicate less than a quarter of their annual grant-making dollars to nonprofit endowment funding. On the next slide, we see from our interviews that we heard from foundation leaders about why they fund endowments. One leader made the connection between endowments and nonprofit sustainability, saying, if we're going to be able to do meaningful, lasting change, but nonprofits are worried about how to make payroll next month, you can't focus your energies in a strategic way. And that's where an endowment really comes into play. In terms of how endowment giving sits within the context of a foundation's broader grant making, another leader said the following. We enter a conversation with a potential grantee and think, where could we be the most beneficial to you with our investment? We look for good organizations serving a population we're interested in supporting and with strong leadership. Then we decide what type of funding we're going to give them. Now, on the next slide, in our second key finding, we delve into who receives endowment funding from foundations. And we found that the majority of foundations that fund nonprofit endowments make those grants to arts and direct services organizations. And most use an existing relationship with a nonprofit as a criterion for endowment funding. And advancing equity is not the primary consideration in most foundations' decision-making. Now, on the next slide, we see that when foundations were asked what types of nonprofits they grant endowments to, we see that these are often traditional endowment candidates. If you look closely at the top two bars on this chart, we see that over half of foundations chose museums, arts, or direct service organizations to receive endowment funding. And we see that with the next two bars show is that the two most selected categories next are education organizations and colleges or universities. Now, on the next slide, we see that we also asked about the criteria foundations use to determine who receives nonprofit endowment funding. And we see on the top bar of this chart that 66% of foundations report using an existing relationship with a nonprofit. This is followed by nonprofit characteristics on the bars that follow, such as leadership, mission, and goals. Now, on the next slide, on this subject of using existing relationships with nonprofits, one foundation leader explained the following. It's not a grant that we would typically make to a new organization that we don't know well. For ones that we have worked closely with, we know the leadership, we know the culture, we know the impact that they're having, so we feel comfortable doing it in those cases. Now, on the next slide, you'll see that we also asked foundations if equity was a primary consideration in their decision to fund nonprofit endowments. And only a third of foundations reported that it was a primary consideration for them. Now, on the next slide, we see that the subset of foundations that were then asked about the types of equity they consider when they're funding nonprofit endowments. And racial equity was the most commonly selected response option. We see on the next slide that one foundation leader makes the connection between endowment funding and equity by saying the following. Ultimately, an endowment is about opportunity. What we're all trying to do is level the playing field and truly give opportunity and access to more and to all. Now, our last key finding comes from the 69% of foundations that do not currently fund nonprofit endowments. In this group, few foundations plan to fund endowments in the future, most often because they do not see it being aligned with their mission, their funding strategy, or size. Now, we see here on this chart that of the foundations that do not fund nonprofit endowments, 42% indicate that they have never considered doing so, while 4% indicate they are currently considering it. We see on the next slide that when these foundations were asked why they do not fund nonprofit endowments, over half provided one of the following reasons: misalignment with the foundation's mission or strategy, preference for providing more flexible funding, such as general operating support, the foundation's own lack of funds, or a preference for seeing the funding used in the near term for more immediate impact. We see here that one leader references donor intent as a reason against funding endowments, saying, "We received a considerable gift from the family estate, and there is a sense of duty and obligation to steward those resources as was the wish of the donor." Another foundation leader highlights how endowment grant making is not a suitable tool given their foundation's priorities. Specifically, they state that given where the current board is and our current grant making strategy, we are very focused on direct services and program grants in specific areas of interest. Now, to our knowledge, this new CEP research is one of the only attempts to measure the prevalence of and approaches to endowment grant making among foundations. We hope this work can help inform discussions about endowment grant making among foundation staff, leaders, and boards. And I'm super excited to share now and pass the mic over to Darren from Bridgespan to talk more about work they've done in this area.
Alicia, so wonderful to present with you and happy to jump in, take the mic and continue the conversation. And so I would love to share a little bit about endowments for BIPOC-led organizations as part of the work that we did. On the next slide, what you'll see is that the objectives for this conversation are two-part. So I want to give you guys a sense of Bridgespan, who we are, our work in racial equity and philanthropy, and how it fits to a larger multi-year initiative and our larger organizational goals, and then really provide some insights on our endowment findings through the lens of our recent publication that we did in part with our WJF, and also tip the conversation for a little bit later as well. So just a quick introduction to Bridgespan, who we are for folks who don't know. On the next slide, you'll get a sense of who we are as an organization. So our work really falls into 4 buckets: nonprofit and NGO strategy consulting, which I think most folks know us for; our philanthropy consulting, supporting organizations and funders; our leadership development; and also our developing and sharing insights. And I come to you wearing a few hats, but most importantly, the one around developing and sharing insights from a work perspective. It's the bucket that this work fell under. Our racial equity and philanthropy work is a multi-year initiative that really seeks to influence the behaviors of funders as a way of addressing the barriers to capital that leaders of color face in the work. And so really the goal is, looking through this work, we hope that we can increase funding to organizations led by people of color, and also just create a more trust-based relationships between funders and leaders of color as gauged by the nonprofit leaders. So that work in part is through seeking insights, expertise from the leaders themselves, amplifying those insights and expertise to large audiences, and making sure that translates to best practices for funders. And on the next slide, you'll see where this work fits into the largest set of publications that we've done as an organization. And so I'll talk a little bit about this in just a bit, but back in November 2021, we did a piece on endowments for Black-led nonprofits. So really thinking about how do we center endowments as a way of driving effective strategies and sustaining the network and community of BIPOC leaders that are driving the work that we seek. There are other publications that many may have seen. This one of thinking about movement, and criminal justice piece, groundwater, my podcast, personal plug, Dreaming in Color, where we're interviewing leaders of color and having them talk about how their genius exhibits itself in the work itself. And then today we'll be talking about the case study on RWJF's approach to endowment grant making. On the next slide, you'll get a take from our hot take from our SSIR article back in 2021. And this work was really in many ways formed by our desire to make sure that we're able to increase funding going to BIPOC-led organizations, particularly Black-led nonprofits, and those who are leading social justice work. And we found that the principal data that drove this work was that endowments of organizations led by people of color were nearly 4 times smaller than those of white-led organizations. So it spoke to the discrepancies from a funding perspective and the lack of funding for nonprofits, particularly BIPOC-led nonprofits. And one of the big takeaways from that work was just really positioning endowments as not just a gift of money, but a transfer of power. And so really thinking about how you position endowments as the ultimate form of trust-based philanthropy, giving organizations the ability to not only think about sustainability in the short term, but also the space to think about what success looks like in the long term, giving them the lens and ability to really think about solving social problems 20 years out and 30 years out, as opposed to the short-term solutions that we're asking of them now. And so that was the thinking for the 2021 article. On the next slide, you'll get a sense of the piece that we did with WJF, and that work was really about helping them codify their endowment grant-making strategy. So the case study that we created with them really offers an overview of our WJF's approach to nonprofit endowment grant-making and really giving folks a sense of how philanthropy can use endowment grant making for equitable social change. It was done in collaboration with interviews with the organization itself, staff, endowment grantees, and other external endowment experts. And the goal was really to document the approach that RWJF embarked on back in 2021 to really adopt endowment grant making strategy in a strategic and equitable way. And so really the goal here was to capture this approach, capture the work, where they ultimately awarded some $5 million to each of three racial justice organizations, including Faith in Action, Unidos USA, and NAACP, to offer the field some degree of a blueprint for what it could look like and may look like, and also make sure that folks have a sense of best practices of how to do this work and what things they should really be considering in carrying out the work as well. On the next slide, I want to offer just some insights of the work. So moving forward, you'll see there are many ways that nonprofits can use endowments to advance their mission, right? I mean, shout out to my boy, George Suttles over at Common Fund Institute, offered us this idea of having a level of autonomy and the ability to grow wealth as a game changer, because now we're talking about multi-generational strategies that are going to transform communities and build new things we've never seen before. And so even as we think about this work, that can come in different forms. It's a way to really stabilize and grow operating budgets, offer folks the space to think about innovative programs and initiatives, really think about community impact investments and prioritizing community insights as a way of driving impact. And it's also just building basic land and asset purchases. So really stabilizing the organization. And so we saw with this work that endowments really can play a very key part in stabilizing organizations. And as George points out, giving them the autonomy to think about what success looks like. On the next slide, I think it's really important as we talk about the work that we did with RWJF to share how we thought about the learnings for foundations, philanthropists, and others who seek to better understand the path forward. And so RWJF was really best practices in a few ways. One, thinking from an internal process, establishing really a cross-functional working group of members from its program, finance, and legal teams, in addition to engaging with external experts. So making sure that this was a cross-office, cross-organization endeavor in which everyone understood the work that they brought to make this happen, but also the importance of this work within their various portfolios. Researching nonprofit endowments from their respective vantage points and collaborating to establish an endowment strategy and funding criteria. So understanding each of them from their vantage point, why this was important, and how the work could be carried out from an implementation perspective as well. I think it was also interesting to see how the working group engaged potential grantees in information gathering discussions about endowments. So RWJF made it perfectly clear that they wanted to make this a organization-led process. And they wanted to be supportive in helping the organization think through this work in a way that was smart and thoughtful, and not being seen as a bully in the process itself, but really putting themselves in a service capacity. Criteria for endowment grantees themselves, when considering endowment grantee funding, RWJF looked for organizations that target problems aligned with the foundation strategy. So as an organization, they understand the extremely important role that dismantling racially problematic systems plays in driving the outcomes that they seek. And so this idea of finding organizations that understand this role and were dedicated to this work from a long-term perspective were really important to them. With that, demonstrating shared values with the foundation, critical to the mission itself. And given that starting an endowment requires a lot of upfront work, RWJF sought to out grantees that had already determined endowment was the right fit for their organizations. So once again, they want to work with folks who already said yes to this work in various forms and needed help to figure out how to make that happen in a smart and thoughtful way. On the next slide, I want to talk through just a few implications of how philanthropy can unlock the potential of endowment funding. And so we'll talk about a little bit more in the next phase of conversation. But ultimately, endowments can be used in three critical ways. So one, embracing new mental models about nonprofit endowments. So as a foundation, endowments can prepare nonprofits to address new issues and challenges, really allow them to be thoughtful, responsive, and strategic in its most basic sense. It allows organizations to think past basic survival and set ambitious goals. So it allows leaders to actually think about the long term, think about 20 years out, think past the current fire that exists in the worlds that we are, and think about what success looks like from a long-term perspective. I think it's also important to think that recognize that endowed organizations will still need funding, right? So the endowment is not you endow them and then you step away. And I think one of the things we want to talk about in the next conversation is, very often we think of this idea of trust-based philanthropy as drop the money and run. But ultimately, as you think about trust-based philanthropy, it's about setting organizations up for success and using all of your power and influence as a philanthropic partner to make them arrive at that point. So think about how as you may endowment organization, you may support programs still. Endowment is just another tool and another way to fund an organization. Doesn't mean that you stop other forms as well. Once again, it was important for them to understand where grantees are in their endowment journeys. You have to meet people where they are. Organizations that are at different levels of readiness, depending on their current financial situations and familiarity with endowments themselves. Really, for funders, it's important for them to think about providing values-aligned financial guidance to nonprofits, to give them the space to think about what this could do for them and how this could set them up for success, how they could use an endowment to support their long-term goals from a vision perspective, a mission perspective, and also financial perspective. It was also particularly interesting in the conversations to think about organizations led by leaders of color who typically have smaller revenues and fewer unrestricted net assets than their white-led counterparts. How do they think big in many ways around endowments, endowment funding, and setting up their organization, and think about success past the fiscal year? Think about success in a long-term perspective in a way that may come across as selfish to the organizations themselves, but is very much so needed for the field and the organization to be successful from a work perspective. And then finally, getting creative and leveraging endowments to advance equity. Because endowment giving is underutilized, the opportunity is huge. And that's something that we've realized so much in the work, in creating this work and creating the initial piece, how others are living into that work and that thinking. One of the guiding quotes for the early work was the wonderful Octavia Butler quote, "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And so how do we use this old tool to cast new suns for others to live under that light? So really thinking about the impact of those investments through endowments, through local economic community building and socially responsible investments. Also remember that endowment funding does not replace other types of funding. It is an additional tool to complement other grant types. And so how do you think about using those different funding types for solving different strategic questions or strategic opportunities? And so that's all that I have from here. I would love for you guys to stay connected with us at Bridgespan, stay connected with the work, offer some websites here, some email addresses. And with that, I'm going to pass to our last slide, and Alicia, bring you back up on screen to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Darren. And I am super excited to welcome our amazing moderator for today, Maisha Simmons, and President and CEO of the Schott Foundation, John Jackson.
Thank you, Alicia. And just as John and I are joining the call, we're so excited to be here with you and get this conversation started. So Alicia, since you already introduced John as part of the leader of the Schott Foundation, I figure we'll jump right on in. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank CEP and Bridgespan for the work that they did as we started to think about our endowment journey at RWJF. We think about an endowment as a tool, and it's a tool of many that can be used as you think about philanthropy's role in addressing structural racism and supporting our efforts in our working communities. This exploration of how endowment can be used as a tool really for us was an opportunity to match our commitment to addressing structural racism and its connection to health and a tool that lives on with longevity of organizations. So as you heard in the CEP survey, it's not being used in the forms of advocacy and organizing organizations as much as it could be, but we're going to hear some more about that from John and what they're doing, but also that we're hoping this is a spark and that this ignites excitement both in the field of funders who are interested in this tool, as well as nonprofits who are interrogating this tool for their use in the future. So I'm going to start the conversation today with a question. And Darren, I know you just had a mouthful, but I think you had something to drink there and you're ready to talk again. So I'll start with you and then we're going to go to John. But you talked about this a little bit in your presentation, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit deeper about equity as a consideration in endowment funding and why endowment is so important to equity.
Yes, Maisha, I'm always ready to go. So fret not. So yes, I mean, as I think it's worth, before even jumping into that question, I think it's important to recognize the world that we're in now and the precarious state that we're in as a country and as a nonprofit space, and recognize that, we as a country and the philanthropic world, we've underfunded nonprofit organizations led by people of color quite ridiculously over time. And so from a parity perspective, Black and Brown-led organizations, those organizations working towards social justice work, they are not as well funded or structured as they should be, right? And so I think that as you think about both philanthropy's role and also endowment's role, there's a need to really shore up the gaps to make sure that organizations are sustained and sustainable and able to carry out the work from a long-term perspective. I think with that as well, and I know in all of the worlds and the conversations that we're having now around pushback, around equity and all the various other issues, I think we rob ourselves of the opportunity of giving ourselves some degree of credit for how much we've grown as a country in the past 10 years. I like to say that within the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, we've had a huge equity and social justice growth spurt. We've grown tremendously in the past 10 years. And as a result, our old systems, our old clothes, our old narratives don't work, right? They don't fit, right? And so as a country and as a sector, we're now trying to figure out how do we create new ones. And that's where organizations that are led by people of color are able to come in, jump in, and actually bring us the answers that we need given the space that we're in now. And that's where there's a need in many ways to make sure those organizations, those leaders have the space to do that. And that space is mental space, intellectual space, and financial space. And this is where endowments are important because they give organizations an opportunity to actually think strategically, to unlock BIPOC genius from a leadership perspective and think about success from a long-term perspective, and not just within the fiscal year and within the fiscal cycle. So I think from an equity perspective, the endowment piece really gives organizations a way to shore up their work and their thinking, and also think strategically and think in a way that we actually need them to be doing the work because the systems as they're working now aren't working. And so we have to give people the space who have the answers and the solutions to be thinking about that and to have the power to do that as well. And John, I know you got all kind of thoughts on that as well. So I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. And thank you, Darren, for the work that you and Bridgespan did to really highlight the model at Robert Wood Johnson and Alicia, the work at CEP, because often the case within the philanthropic sector, we don't evaluate some of our behaviors and some of our procedures. And not everything that we do is strategic. Some of it is just simple and easy. And quite frankly, some of our behaviors contribute to the long-term existence of racial disparities. And this is one of the examples that at SHOT, we are a public fund. So in many respects, we serve as an intermediary. We don't have a large endowment like a Robert Wood Johnson or some of the other philanthropic organizations. But we wanted to, recognizing that we fund grassroots organizations that ensure that our democracy works, they ensure that our democracy stays in relation with all of its people. And this is a battle that wasn't going to be won or lost overnight. We wanted to ensure that we provided the long-term sustainability for national alliances. So we launched a $30 million campaign to endow 3 racial justice organizations over the next 5 years. That meant that an organization that with a $7 million endowment, I had to go as CEO to my board and ask, could we raise more money than we have to give out endowments larger than our own? And the board, because of our strategic focus, said, let's do it. Because quite frankly, these are organizations that have proven that they can do more with less. Why not give them more to do more? And it's strategic in the sense that I often say that this is not a new strategy. When I look at some of the strategies that were connected to overturning reproductive rights or challenging reproductive rights, those were not grant-making strategies. Those were, to the point that Darren raised, large amounts of dollars being given to institutions, hundreds of millions of dollars, so that they could strategically, over decades, work on a strategy. And some of those dollars end up in the endowment of these organizations. So in many respects, I think that this is the next phase of trust-based philanthropy that as a full sector, we have to catch up with. And it's something that I think will help us accelerate some of the progress that we would like to see within the racial justice space.
Thanks, John. And, Alicia, in the CEP report, and I'm not sure if you want to get in on this a little bit, but, in that there was equity, racial equity was a consideration in folks making decisions about endowments. Is there anything else you want to add just from the data or from what you've learned around this question connecting endowments?
Yeah, I mean, Maisha, you think when we embarked, on this project, we were really interested to see what amount of foundations were using this as a strategy. And we were really surprised that the numbers are actually quite low. And so I think that shows us that there's a lot of space to be doing more of this kind of grant making. The other thing that was surprising is that even folks who are doing it are not necessarily thinking of it as a racial equity strategy. And I think especially at a moment where, there are a lot of questions out there around like, what are some things that we're doing that are not reactive, but proactive? This is clearly one of those tools. And so, I think having this data for me is just like a push to the field to say like, if in all the tools you have, how are you using this as one of the things at your disposal, especially at this crucial moment?
Yeah, I mean, as we think about tools and we're focusing on, and some may say, well, are funding endowments the only way? The CEP report showed that funders are funding endowments. The Bridgespan report showed that as well. But how should funders think about when and to whom they should employ endowment funding? And John, since you have some experience with that already in the Endow Now campaign, can you talk a little bit about that? And then I would love for others to join as they think about it.
Sure. I think it's important to note that even the report indicated funding endowments, while it doesn't happen often within philanthropy, it's not anything that's foreign. We endow museums, we endow hospitals, we endow colleges and universities. And what we have to understand is grassroots BIPOC-led organizations are the brick and mortar of our democracy. They are who ensure our democracy works. And so there has to be some investment that ensures their longevity and their work. Our democracy is not a destination, it's a journey. So we have to ensure that we're providing the sustainable resources for these organizations who are pillars of our democracy, to do what they do best to ensure that our democracy worked. In 1954, when our democracy didn't want all young people to attend schools together, it's because of the NAACP and Brown versus the Board of Education and nameless and faceless people who leaned in to bring about Brown. So as we commemorate the 70th anniversary of Brown this year, and we recognize how far more we still need to go, we've got to recognize that we need to invest in the infrastructure necessary for us to get there. So while we commemorate Brown at 70, we've got to think, what does it take to get Brown at 75 and get the vision of Brown fulfilled by 75?
And Maisha, can I jump in as well and build on John's point? I think it's, so a few things. I think one, what's interesting actually from an endowment perspective is as you think about success, I think one of the things, one of the narratives that you have to disrupt within the work in general is that I joke this myth that good nonprofit organizations should be working to put themselves out of business. They're going to solve the issue. And if you're good at what you do in 5 years, you don't have to be around anymore, right? And if we know anything, particularly as Black Americans have been here for a while and seen quite a few things, oppression is clever in this country. And the second you solve one issue, another issue pops up. So we have to be able to enable organizations to have the space to strategically shift to address the issues as they arise within the country in itself. I think that it also speaks to, as you think about endowment strategies, a larger shift that's happening in philanthropy. That's a good one from a trust-based philanthropy perspective. Historically, foundations have existed as super smart, good foundations have existed as super smart institutions that have had beautiful theories of changes with boxes, and as a Bridgespan, I've been responsible for that, and I take pride in that work. And they have looked to nonprofits as vendors for their strategies, right? I think that we see, particularly in the last 5 years and the shift that have happened, that success, if success is to happen, requires nonprofits and those that are community-driven and community engaged, they have their own theories of change from a success perspective and look to funders as smart payers and supporters of that work, right? And I think endowments allow that. Endowments allow organizations not to just exist as vendors that solve for one issue, but actually as complex, strategic, and smart organizations that are creating community-driven approaches to what success looks like that take time. And they need the ability from a financial perspective and strategic perspective to invest in those strategies and learn and grow. And that's where endowments actually fit into that work as well.
Alicia, any findings you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, one thing I would also just highlight to piggyback off what John and Darren are sharing is just the importance of context as well in terms of nonprofits having flexibility to make decisions they need to make. So in a couple of weeks at CEP, we're going to be publishing another report on the state of nonprofits. And I think, one of the things that will be in that report is kind of a spoiler alert, but I think not necessarily a news flash to anyone who's in the sector. But that burnout continues to be a main concern among staff, and staff turnover is a concern. And we all know that regardless of what kind of organization you're running, when you have high levels of turnover, you need to be able to have flexibility in terms of how you're making decisions around staffing and be really creative. And being able to do that requires having funds that you can use in very flexible ways. And so, I think as funders think about like how to make sure they're taking into account this context that we're all working in, having endowments as one of several strategies of flexible funding is also very important to making sure that folks can shift and change based on what's also happening internally at organizations at this moment as well.
So we've talked about peers, we've talked about flexibility, we've talked about the long run. And I'd like to just dig in a little bit more about kind of our grantee partners, right? Our grantee peers, as you talked about, Darren. And through your report, you kind of lump the grantee community that is thinking about this into about 3 buckets. It is the grantees with limited understanding about endowments, grantees that are getting ready to launch their endowments, and grantees that have already established their endowments. And, funders, we have a role to play as they're exploring all those financial options, even if the endowment is not their ultimate goal, right? But it's trying to understand what's happening. What advice do you have for funders as they are having these conversations with their grantee partners? And I can share as well when we get appropriate time of some of the things that we did as well.
Yeah, Maisha, I'm going to offer some thoughts and throw it back to you because I'm sure you have some thoughts as well. I know you have some thoughts. I got my thoughts from you. But I think that, there are a few things that we should be thinking about. And so once again, I want to reposition this language around making sure that we have a true understanding of what trust-based philanthropy is. Because once again, I'm all about disrupting myths. There's this myth that good trust-based philanthropy means dropping the money and running, right? Just give them the money and run, right? And I think that when you do something like that, you actually don't take advantage of all the power and positionality you have as a good funder to support organizations. And so I think that it's important for organizations to meet funders, to meet organizations where they are on their journeys, right? To understand what they hope to get out of this, what success looks like, where they are from a growth and sustainability perspective, but also to give them the space to exist in a place of abundance, as silly as that may sound. I think we've normalized within this world, particularly for Black-led organizations, Black and Brown-led organizations, socialist organization, we have normalized operating without infrastructure, operating without proper funding, operating without sustainable funding or long-term funding as not only the norm, but best practices. It's dangerous, right? We're telling people you're spending too much on your overhead costs. Why are you expecting them to run an organization, right? And so I think that it's important for funders to give these organizations who have in many ways normalized bad practices from an operational perspective, give them a little gentle push to think about what success looks like and how they can develop more sustainable funding and more sustainable funding models and actually live into their strategies. And so I think with each of those approaches, you think about the organizations where they are, giving them a sense of supports that meets them where they are, but also allows them to move forward and work and thinking becomes really strategic and really important. And I think that's ultimately it's about the funder acting not just as a funder from a funder-vendor perspective, but really as a strategic partner and a funding partner, helping them understand where they are and where they're trying to go. And I joke, ultimately, you want funders that are not going to say no all the time, but yes, how, right? Like, how are we going to get there, right? And I think that's really important as you think about that work in itself. Maisha, I also want to tee this up as well, and I would love for you to share a little bit more before we turn to our other colleagues here. I think that you guys were really, really thoughtful in a really smart way about how do we think about this as just an additional tool, right? A tool, like you got a whole drawer of tools, right? This is one of the many. And we may use 2 or 3 tools, we may use 4, and so it's not necessarily this and nothing else. It's not, well, we're going to fund your endowment. You're not getting programmatic funding anymore. They are different tools that serve different purposes. And thinking about that, I think was very much so. It was just really strategic. It really showed how much you guys understood your role as a strategic funder and how much we're really thinking about supporting organizations. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about that before we throw it to the others as well.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I mean, one of the things that as you were talking and I was remembering our journey, one of the things that I want to pull through is the essence of partnership across the foundation. And, early on, we recognized that if we're only from the folks who work on program are thinking about the endowment tool and what it could do, it's a short-sighted conversation. If our legal and finance are only thinking about what can and cannot happen from a legal and finance purview or a due diligence purview, it's a short-sighted conversation. So one of the things we did early on was pull in together a work group of colleagues who have these multiple perspectives to then begin to dream and imagine into what's the realm of possibilities for us as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I think one of the things that are clear in the Bridgespan report, and whenever we talk about this is just the approach that worked for us. It is not the gold star of what the field should be doing, because as you've heard from what John is doing, they're doing some things that are very different and it works for them and their organization. And the other piece, it's that narrative of partnership. Each of the organizations that we provided endowment support are, they had been long-term grantee partners. Their endowments were all in very different places. And so if we were to take a cookie cutter approach and say, well, we'll only fund an endowment that looks like X, Y, and Z and has these types of returns and this type of variables, again, we would not be able to get into the nuance of what the field needs as they are investing and interrogating this. NAACP was launching their endowment campaign. Unidos US had a long-term endowment. And then Faith in Action had one that was kind of bequested by a gift and was thinking about, well, what does it mean to grow this outside of this one specific gift into a much broader financial tool that we can use across the organization. And we spent months having these conversations, understanding what we can do. And then what is unique and different is we designed our process to what the grantee need. We didn't create the process and then say, now fit this into what we say needs to happen. Of course, we have all the legal and financial bases covered, but we really wanted to think about a process that is in the spirit of the endowment, and which is, to your point, Darren, about trust. We're not going to be investment managers with the organizations as they think about the investment tools that they want to use. We want to know and understand them, but we're not going to be deeply embedded in that. As you think about how you want to draw off your earnings of the endowment, we're not going to then package it into a set of specific programmatic ideals that we have together. Though that interest is for you to use in terms of what your organization needs. So really leaning into organizations know what they need best. They know what their communities need best. Our resources are yet another tool to think about that. And then the one thing I just also want to really lean into, because it was, if I'm being transparent, it was a critical conversation for us around, so should we stop programmatic funding if we do endowment? Is it a sunset? Is it a way to end the funding? And we really had deep conversation about, no, if we believe in some of these organizations are older than everybody on this call, and they've been fighting these issues over 100 years. So if we believe in the work that they're committed to in community, we should be committed to their long-term plan for longevity, right? Over 100 years existing, and you don't have a financial tool to help you think about perpetuity, as well as fund our strategic, our opportunistic, our advocacy-oriented goals together. And I think it's that combination that really helped us think about this readiness and understanding the diversity of the field of organizations, even if, even as long-term partners, we got to know them outside the issues that we worked on together and the dreams that they have for their organizations. But I definitely want to turn this over to you, John, because again, you're seeing a variety of organizations as they're thinking about their endowment journey and how you all have thought about the partnerships that's involved with that.
Well, one thing I've discovered, my connection will only allow you to either hear my voice or see my face. So as my screen goes out, it looks like you're getting the better half of the stick. But, Darren highlighted something in the case study, the work that you all did, Maisha, that I thought was significant. One, that you all started with a yes framework, meaning that you knew that there will be a host of questions and challenges that you all came together to overcome. One, you do have to start with the organizations where they are. With the organizations that we work with, we've pulled in our operations team, we pulled in our investment advisors, and those national alliances are sitting at the investment table with us. So in the process, they're also learning how to manage an endowment from an investment perspective, which often the case is, this is not what advocacy organizations do each and every day. At the same time, we recognize that there would be some barriers translating this to other philanthropic partners. We're not, again, a large endowed organization. So we established it as a pooled fund. So whether you are a $250 million endowed organization, or whether you're a family foundation or a checkbook philanthropist, you can invest in a pooled endowment fund that aligns with your specific goals, mission, and all the rest. So we wanted to create, and I think philanthropy has to create a taxonomy of ways in which donors and philanthropies can invest in this endowment strategy. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be so foreign to us. If we look at our own endowments, and if we look at how we approach our investment advisors, we don't give them 1 year of funding. In fact, we don't look at we look at 3, 5, 10 years, and we invest for the long term. Only thing that we're asking is that we apply that practice on the programmatic side, that we provide long-term investment as a part of a balanced portfolio. On the investment side, you have to balance your portfolio. There's equities, there are bonds that do different things based on the condition of the economy. On the programmatic side, there are general operating grants, there are project grants, and we want to add to that playlist endowment grants so that there's a balanced portfolio on the programmatic side. So much of this, again, isn't new. It's just taking what we know to solve many of the challenges that might exist in actually getting there.
Yes, I actually, that analysis is really helpful in terms of thinking about the balance of the two worlds of what it takes to manage these funds. Alicia, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And you mentioned that there were some barriers for funders to endow nonprofits, which include misalignment with mission or strategy, or a preference for general support, lack of funds, or preference for immediate use of funds. What do you think are your reactions, or what are some of your reactions to some of those reasons why funders may have lifted these up as you were doing your analysis?
Yeah, Maisha, I found the reason really interesting that folks shared, mostly because, some of the pieces around like misalignment with mission or strategy or preference for general operating support, right? Like supporting an endowment is another way of supporting the general operations of an organization, right? But doing it just using a different tool. And so I think, what it illuminated for me is that, there may be times where folks may have a very narrow view of like the tools available to them and just have not thought about this as one of the possibilities. I think one of the other really interesting things at the intersection of this is that folks are funding, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, performing arts organizations and museums at these high rates, which means, right, like funding an endowment, even if that's not maybe the intention, what we're saying is we want that organization to be around for a long time to continue doing that work. And I think, if we're saying that about museums and arts organizations, then it causes me to pause and think, well, why aren't we saying that same kind of thing about other kinds of organizations too? because what sorts of investments we make and when we make them and what tools we use and how we think there are at our disposal. I think all this data just like pushes up to the surface a lot of questions that folks can use as they're like thinking through their own lens of like, wait, why am I having that thought that I can do this and I can't do that? Because maybe this thing that I just haven't seen as a possibility is actually more of an option than I initially thought it was.
And can I jump in there as well? Because Alicia, I love you and I love how charitable you are with. I found it interesting. I mean, it's a nice way of saying I found it problematic as all hell. But yeah, so I think that there is definitely something to be said about how so many of these organizations or funders, they don't think of the organizations that they work with as true strategic partners and true strategic owners from a thought perspective. And so they are funding them from a short-term perspective. There is a desire to hold on to the answer. There's a desire to have them to some degree on a leash from a strategic perspective, or they don't necessarily recognize the potential of unleashing them, if that makes sense at all. And so I think that folks fund museums, folks fund universities, folks fund these health institutions because they see them as idea producers. And they trust that they're going somewhere with the work and the thinking that may, it's an investment that may not pay out for 10 years or so, right? Or 20 years or 30 years, but there's a desire to really fund them in a way that's thoughtful. And allows them to think through that work. I think with, one of the larger issues that I see as you talk with funders that are thinking about this work, they've had a shift in understanding their role, understanding the impact potential of the field, and understanding in many ways that the philanthropic world and the nonprofit world as it currently exists is not working. And so we have to fund some other idea makers and give them a space to think about what long-term success looks like. So this is, I love the idea of endowments as a moral play and a behavior play, but this is an efficiency play, right? This is the way of getting the impact that we seek. Right? I'm all about facts and data here, right? Like this is a way of us getting at those answers that we need from a field perspective and really unlocking the genius. And I think that when you can think of those folks as genius producers, it allows that to happen in a way that's smart and thoughtful. I think also, Alicia, one of the questions that I find really interesting, and John, I would love for you to talk about this because I kind of feel like it speaks to your work and how you've thought about it. Very often organizations will say, oh, well, we're not working with the kind of money that allows us to endow someone, right? But folks are definitely working with the kind of privilege and positionality that allows them to develop endowments. And so just how do you think about even an endowment campaign, what role you play in helping organizations get endowments as a funder? Maisha has shown how, they played all the roles, right? From the actual funding piece, using their power and privilege in other ways. But John, you're shown as well that there are different approaches to that. So Maisha, I just want to throw that up as a question, because I feel like folks really have some thoughts there too.
You want to start, Alicia?
You start, John. That's you.
Sure. I think that first we have to recognize, again, that there are opportunities, regardless of the type of philanthropy or the type of donor, for you to catalyze endowments. And there is an opportunity for us at the Schott Foundation. The role that we took is that we're going to aggregate the capital. We're going to coalesce a group of funders to pool a fund that will total $30 million to provide endowments to 3 organizations. Again, that's just one model, but there are other ways, to sort of get there. I also think that, it does take at the board level, asking and answering the questions for board members, is our fiduciary responsibility solely to sustaining the organization or sustaining the work? Is it best for us to grow $1 trillion endowment within our institution, or to begin to build a series of endowed networked organizations who can anchor the work that is happening? So those are just some fundamental questions that I think have to be raised, have to be answered, but there is a way to get here. Again, the brilliance of the case study is it took us deep into the Robert Wood Johnson way. And there are other ways for different donors, for different philanthropies to get in the game.
And I think with getting in the game, I am going to pivot to some of the Q&A from our audience, if we're all ready for those questions. So bear with me, I'm going to be toggling through screens to get to those questions. I am still a one-screen girl all these years into this. So I'm going to start with the first question that I have pulled up here. And I think this is, I'm going to try to combine a somewhat of a theme that I'm hearing. So one could argue that the endowment gifts are highly restricted because nonprofits can't touch or do not touch the principal typically. What's a better way to support a grassroots organization, an endowment gift or a totally unrestricted McKinsey Scott style large grant? The latter leaves it to the nonprofits to decide how and when to use it. Isn't that the more supportive way to fund organizations? Anyone want to take that first?
I can jump in with some thoughts. So, I mean, first and foremost, yes, I say yes to all of them, right? No, we're not saying don't do all the. This work is not about restricting people to one funding source. This work is about opening up funding sources. So yes, big gifts, yes, I'm all about it, right? And I think that, so for us, I think that what's interesting about endowment gifts is that there are a few things that we were trying to solve for in the first article that we put out. One, and it was a non-traditional Bridgespan article in many ways, Maisha. I think I shared this with you. The first article back in 2021. Usually Bridgespan and CP, you'll appreciate this. We produce, 3,000 years of studies, and then we share what we've learned, right? As this is the final answer. And this was more, we got a thought on this. Let's put it out as a way of starting a conversation, right? And so with that, like the goal was to show that there are different ways of funding organizations and some may be more useful to others. It is never a bad idea to give organizations a big amount of unrestricted funding. There's no world in which that's a bad answer, right? And so, yes, that's always a great answer. It serves a different purpose as well. And so ultimately, what the endowment we were hoping to do from an endowment perspective is that we were hoping, one, we saw a lot of organizations that weren't able to receive big gifts because of all the restrictions that we have as funders around absorptive capacity. And your biggest grant can only be, your next grant can be only as big as your biggest grant, right? And so we're trying to figure out ways to actually give organizations an ability to up the grant amount that's normalized for them to receive, right? And so at the end of the day, if the biggest grant you've ever received is $500,000, then you're not in a capacity actually to receive a $10 million gift, right? There is a way, however, for organizations to think about how do you create endowments that the spend down is all that you need from an annual basis. Bigger is not always better from a size perspective and from an impact perspective, but what's most important is having some degree of security around the funding that you received and making sure you have that available, and also giving organizations some stability around pieces that might be harder for them to fundraise around. Fundraising can be really helpful from a strategic perspective, from a buy-in perspective, or community building perspective as well, right? But it can be restrictive in other ways. So the short answer there is, it's not a question of saying one is better than other and then another. I think it's a question more of making sure that people have all the options possible and are able to stabilize the organization in a way that makes sense.
And if I can provide a direct example, we received a $10 million gift from McKinsey Scott, and we used those resources to provide operating grants, general grants to organizations, and we invested $2.5 million into an endowment fund. So again, it's two separate strategies, both enhance the capacity and the sustainability of the organizations.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to pivot to a question that I think, Alicia, this is going to be right up your alley in terms of some of the research that you did. So the question is, I'm curious about whether you asked in your studies or found that grant makers are influenced by the following factors in providing endowment funding: fixed costs that are hard to cover with operating revenues, desired permanence of the nonprofit in its community, long-term nature of the benefits that a nonprofit offers, example, education versus emergency needs, and a need to diversify operating income with investment income to provide greater stability.
So in the survey, we gathered a little bit of data on the second of those. So around desired permanence of nonprofits. So in the interviews that we conducted with foundations, some of them mentioned nonprofit sustainability was mentioned by the majority of funders as a rationale for funding endowments. Some of those other ones did not come up as much in interviews. I did also, though, just want to circle back to the earlier question around the endowments versus the big gifts, because we at CP have done a lot of research as well around specifically Mackenzie Scott's big gifts. And I just wanted to know, and I know Darren was like, Alicia loves that word. I was like, I found the question interesting. Because my immediate reaction was both, right? That organizations need both. Like and it's fascinating to me because when we think about for-profit organizations, right, who are like making things and getting capital from that, we want them to have the space to be imaginative and figure out how they're going to make the most capital, to like focus all their energy and time on the thing that they are doing. And I would argue that if you are always thinking about the long term, because you don't have a plan for that, you haven't had the resources to do planning for that, and if you are thinking about the immediate term, both of those things take away from your time and energy to actually do the main thing that you're there to do. And I say that as a previous nonprofit executive director myself. So I would argue that actually to do, and especially at this moment where we really need, as I was saying before, proactive responses. So the things that we're seeing around us, not reactive responses, that means people need spaciousness. And to have that spaciousness, you need the near-term worries and the far-term worries a bit more in the background so you can actually focus on work.
I agree. I have nothing to add because you all have said exactly the same thing that I think as well. Okay, let me jump into another question. This question is, how can we educate funders about the power of endowment gifts from the perspective of the nonprofit grantee? Are there tools or resources available to support organizing more funders plus donors to consider moving more towards this approach?
I can jump in, Maish, with some thoughts, and John, I'm sure you have some as well. So one, we're giving y'all all the tools. These are the receipts, right? We got a study from CEP. Bridgespan's writing a report on how it's done. So honestly, I think it's important for organizations from a nonprofit perspective to have, and I've offered some thoughts to nonprofits as they think about the work. How do you tee up this work? And there are a few pointers here. One, I think, and I noted this earlier, it's important for organizations to stop thinking about their work as if I'm doing my job well, I'll be out of business in 5 years. And you're not going to solve racism, oppression, and all. I know you're smart and gifted, but it ain't going to happen, right? So how do you give yourself the runway to carry out this work from a long-term perspective and think about that as success? I think it's important for you, and as a nonprofit leader, to think about, you have to price with pride. You have to think about a true sense of the money that you need and the funding that you need, and be real. Know that number like you know the cost of your morning coffee, right? Or your mortgage payment that's coming out every month. Right. So really have that number in your back pocket and really be thoughtful about what that looks like, and have conversations with, and this is the third point, know your funders. All funders are not created equal. You do not want to go into an endowment conversation with someone that forces you to fill out a 20-page application every year for $10,000. Right. So, I think you have to know which funders you know are in it to win it with you, who are true funding partners, have some flexibility. And I think picking one or two of those funders to start the conversation, and then allowing them to use their power and their privilege to bring others to the table, right? I think that this is where you have to rely on their power and their privilege and their positionality, not just as funders, but as power brokers, right? That's what trust-based philanthropy looks like. It's actually you're trusting the organization and they're trusting you to some degree to bring others into the conversation. Is really important. So I think it's thinking about it as a long-term process, but definitely understanding how the money would be used, having a strong perspective on the work and the thinking, and working with organizations from a funding perspective who look to you as the answer provider, and living into that. And John, I don't know if you have any thoughts there as well.
Next question.
So I just want to add a little bit to that. And you know, the piece that I will add is it's also our job as funders to have this conversation with our field, right? So as much as nonprofits getting to know your funder and understanding who you think would be good partners, I think there's a opportunity for us to think about what are fields that we can share our stories, share our influence, have the conversations about the value of the tool, what it has done for, you know, funders are very centered in their own strategies and their own value of accomplishment. So, you know, translate the conversation amongst funders into what does it look like to talk about how this is a part of your portfolio of tools? What is it doing for your narrative about how you're thinking about long-term impact and improvement, right? An endowment tool is a long-term tool. We have long-term goals. How do we match that together? How do we think about it in the language of short-term goals? If you're not a funder with a long-term goal and you're really trying to think about short-term, what does that interest, what is drawing that interest, what is it able to do for organizations in real time right now? And so I think there is the both and in this equation. And again, it's a conversation, as the CEP report showed us, that is starting to grow, right? And I think those of us who are utilizing tool, being in community and sharing what we're learning is the opportunity for us to kind of bring others into the learning with us as well.
Mike, can I just jump in with a quick thought as well? And this is one, I mean, yes, definitely. Philanthropy, do your role, do your part. This is why we went to school. This is why we have these roles. So live into it for real. I think that also it's important. I was just played back. It was some video somewhere on the internet that's really helpful. This for me this past weekend. A young woman was talking about when she worked at a coffee shop. The most valuable lesson she learned was her boss told her at some point, when carrying a hot object, don't get so focused on carrying the object that you're not sure where you're taking it and where you're going. Right. And so I think it's important for so many of us in this work to be thoughtful about the work we're doing from a short-term perspective, but never lose sight of what we're trying to do from a long-term perspective. And I think, unfortunately, I think that we are all, particularly people of color in the space, we are very strategic in our work and our thinking. Very strategic. We're intuitively very strategic about what long-term success looks like. I joke that Black leaders are the only leaders in the world that can talk about success 3 generations away and no one laughs at them. What their grandchildren are going to be doing, right? But I think that we have to be really thoughtful in voicing that strategic thinking as the answer and what people need from us, not just our answer from a short-term perspective as well. So it's living into your strategic value because it's a skill that needs to be highlighted and celebrated as well.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question. It's getting a little bit more into the how. So a practical question. Could we talk about numbers a little bit? For those of us at smaller foundation, is there guidance for what size of an endowment is useful that may have impact? And is there a minimum amount?
I would say there's no minimum amount. I think an endowment is an investment, and investments grow. Now, obviously, you know, the model that most philanthropic organizations use is a 4 or 5% drawdown. So really looking at your operating costs and looking at a target that would sort of begin to meet some of those costs. Some of the organizations we work with, they start with, what does it take to endow an executive director's position or a CEO, understanding that you will always have, you know, leadership and need leadership in the organization? What does it take to endow an advancement or development position? So you really sort of want to map out what the needs are there and have that conversation with prospective funders. But I would also say, again, just to be deliberately redundant, that every contribution helps toward that meeting that goal. In our pooled fund, we have those that have committed 25,000 and those who have committed 2.5 million. And each of those contributions help us get toward that $30 million total. Because at the end of the day, this is why it goes back to something Darren said. This is why it's not just not something that we're just advocating for, but it's strategic. Several years ago, the market went up 15%. For organizations that had endowments, regardless of where they are on your issue, their overall assets also increased 15%. If you're a foundation that's funding racial equity and you're only providing that organization a grant, they didn't see any benefit in the market increasing. And we've got to sort of get our organizations aligned with achieving some level of social benefits as the market accrue benefits, because there are those who are fighting against your issue that are receiving those benefits, and they will have more assets to fight against you. That's where it becomes strategic for funders to begin to think about how we use this as a strategy to ensure that our partners have everything that they need to be successful.
Maisha, can I jump in quickly just to add to that? So I think, John, your point is spot on. There's nothing too small from a contribution perspective. I think strategically as an organization, as John points out, you should be thinking about however small the funds are, how they're being used to endow a specific thing. And I think strategically that allows you to just differentiate between an endowment that's endowed to support a specific cause and just having a cash reserve, which is, you should have cash reserve. Once again, yes to all the things, but a cash reserve, which isn't necessarily used for the same thing, but you should also have as well. And so I think that's more of a strategic decision for you as an organization. I also want to jump in, Maisha, because y'all are fast. I got 3 questions popping up in LinkedIn for me. So I don't know, and one of the questions that I got was someone asking about how hard it is to hear funders say we don't fund endowments, and to learn just more about framing endowment investments. I think that we've given you quite a lot to talk with here. I think at the end of the day, all of this work is about reminding funders that we're trying to offer them best practice solutions to drive the impact that they seek. And when you don't fund endowments, you're in some ways robbing yourself an opportunity to drive impact in a meaningful way, and you're denying yourself the privilege of pursuing best practices in philanthropy work, right? And so I think reminding them that this is both not just a nice to have, but this is what good looks like, right? And when they say they don't fund endowments, tell them, well, have you talked with so-and-so who does? Have you talked with so-and-so who sees this as a meaningful way? Send them our article. We're more than anybody on this call is happy to talk with the funder. Anyone, each of us, right, who's thinking about this work. And so I think this is where you bring in the resources from a knowledge perspective and a people perspective to make the case and normalize it as something they should be thinking about if they want to be good at the work that they do.
So we had so many questions. Even Darren is getting them on LinkedIn. Lots of questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but I definitely want to thank the panelists for this conversation. And I'm going to turn the call over to Sarah to close. Sarah, excuse me. I was combining both of your names to close us out.
Thank you so much, Maisha. Thank you, John, Alicia, Darren, Maisha, for this wonderful conversation, for sharing your wisdom with us. And with that, I'd like to close us out. So thank you to all of you who joined, and just ask that if you could please spend 2 minutes to help us out. You should have a survey in your inbox asking for feedback about this event. Please fill it out. It would be really helpful to us. And just as a final reminder, we will, of course, send out a recording of this webinar in the next week or so. So thank you again, and farewell until next time. Take care, everyone.